JFT. This is Brian Lehrer Live, where web video meets the issues, or in this case, where 130 still photos greet the world. Here's a 20-second mashup to begin tonight of the 130 photographs that President Obama had taken with world leaders at the UN last week. A sharp-eyed video maker named Eric Spiegelman noticed that the president's official smile is remarkably consistent. We like consistency in our politicians, right? Maybe success in politics comes from smiling like you mean it. On tonight's program, the outgoing public advocate, Betsy Gotbaum, offers advice to Bill de Blasio, who beat Mark Green in yesterday's primary runoff election. Author Beth Fertig will also drop by to explain how illiterate kids graduate from our public schools. And later we'll enjoy a rolling biography of the city. It's called Taxi Confidential. We'll meet the author. And in about 15 minutes, we reveal our video picks of the week, which include a new, safer way to bike to the Manhattan Bridge.
The Sand Street bike path has two different sections to it, really. One is a completely physically separated lane right down the middle. The other section, which runs right through the middle of the Farragut houses, has this mountable curb.
I doubt if they will be pedaling in, but two politicians are about to get new jobs in Manhattan as a result of yesterday's balloting. Assuming they win in November, Queens Councilman John Liu will become the city controller, and Brooklyn Councilman Bill de Blasio will be the new public advocate. He trounced Mark Green, who once held that office. Public advocate is part ombudsman, part vice mayor, part loyal opposition. What can de Blasio expect when he sits in that hot seat? Well, no one knows better than the incumbent, Betsy Gotbaum, who has decided to limit her own terms to 2. Welcome to the program.
Hi, Brian. How are you?
And congratulations on graduating after 8 years.
Yes, thank you so much. I feel like I've graduated with flying colors.
Bill de Blasio is starting a whole new job. He's got expectations. He certainly campaigned to build expectations that he could get some specific things done. What was the difference between the expectations that you had going in and the political reality you met on the ground?
It's a brilliant question, and I have to say it merits a really thoughtful answer, which I'll try to give you, which is when I ran for this office in 2001, and you know what happened in 2001 with 9/11, there were a lot of expectations about trying to make the city a better place, trying to help people. My real motive for running was because I really like helping people. It's kind of who I am. And I figured I could really do that in this office because public advocate is the official ombuds, I say woman, for the city of New York. But the realities of the office are quite different. First of all, it's very, unfortunately, it became and has become very political. And that is because, I guess, the nature of New York City and everybody's jockeying, and maybe it's because of term limits. It's one of the reasons I don't like term limits, because I think everybody's always looking for their next job. And to me, that's a big mistake. Second of all, the real problem with this office, and I've talked to Bill about this, I talked to all the candidates, I brought them in and spent some time talking to them.
And you endorsed de Blasio, we should say.
Yes, I did. I absolutely did endorse de Blasio, and I'm very pleased that he won. But the issue is this office does not have an independent budget. So the history of the office, and it happened to Mark Green, is that the mayor always cuts the budget. I think the mayor doesn't like criticism, whether it's Mayor Giuliani or Mayor Bloomberg. I don't know why they always cut the budget, but they do, because the budget is very small. It's never been more than $3 million.
This is $3 million out of a total, and that's million with an M, out of a total city budget that is what now, about 50 billion?
65 billion.
65 billion.
65 billion. So it's 100. It's 1/200th of 1% of the budget.
And that's what one of only 3 citywide elected officials. There's the mayor, the controller, and the public advocate.
Yes.
So you're one of only 3 citywide elected officials. That's all you get to work with.
That's all you get to work with. And think of it this way. You run citywide, you spend more money running than you have to work with. And not to take anything away from the borough presidents, but a borough president represents a borough, right? They have a much bigger budget than the public advocate. So to me, the reality that hit me coming in was that there is very, very small budget. There are very few resources to do anything that you really need to do. First point. Second point, the mayor cuts the budget, then you have to go to the speaker and beg. And it becomes a political dance, and that's where the politics comes in.
So we have on our screen right now, I think the viewers can see it, a New York Post editorial after your budget was cut by City Council, which magically happened right after you opposed their term limits extension. And what do you get? A picture of you as a baby. Betsy Wetsy throws fit over snub, boycotts council after dollars cut. Now here's a clip of you talking right at the same time, speculating on why your budget may have been cut in your own words.
The speaker has discretionary money, 17 million. How much is your overall?
This is your personal peak of yours.
I can't imagine why I am the only elected official, public advocate, City of New York, is the only elected official that is not restored. I cannot understand why the speaker wouldn't restore such a small amount of money. I mean, we would have accepted some even partial restoration. So it doesn't make any sense to me other than this is pure payback.
Payback for opposing the term limits extension bill because they didn't want somebody with your voice and your stature saying this is wrong for them to extend their own terms?
Absolutely. I think that's part of it. I think there were other reasons too. So I'm somewhat speculative about that, but I think there were other reasons, and I think that it's wrong. I think whether it was because my stand on term limits or whether it's because of the other reasons, it's wrong. This office should not be a political football.
Now, you've said 2 things just in the last 3 minutes. One is you don't like term limits.
Right.
And another is you opposed ending the term limits. So if you don't like term limits, why didn't you go along with what the Speaker and the rest of the Council and the Mayor did?
I felt that it was possible, and I think a lot of us, those elected officials who opposed the Council overturning term limits, said to everybody in town, all the people in the press, to the Mayor, to the Speaker, look, let's do a referendum. We will help you. We'll get out there and raise money for you. We'll go along with you. We'll fight for you.
To end term limits.
To end term limits.
But the people enacted it with a referendum, with 2 referenda over a period of years. So
and that's what we wanted. We wanted a referendum.
Let the people do it.
Let the people do it again. And I think those of us felt very strongly. I felt so strongly that I decided I wouldn't run again when this all happened.
And then when your budget was cut, you also declined to perform another one of your duties, which is to preside over City Council, correct?
Yes. I presided over the City Council at the pleasure of the Speaker because back in 2002, the Mayor had a charter revision trying to get rid of the office of the Public Advocate. And the first step in that process was to remove me from presiding over the City Council. And both speakers invited me, asked me to preside anyway. And I felt, since the Speaker refused to restore my budget, the first time in history of the Public Advocate's office that's ever happened, because she refused to restore my budget, I said, okay, why should I preside over the Council?
What do you do when you preside over the Council as Public Advocate? We know that the Vice President of the United States presides over the Senate, and with 100 senators, if they have a 50-50 tie, he can break that tie with an actual vote. Is it a similar function?
Well, there's no, because there are only 51 council people.
51, which is an odd number.
Yes, so there's no tie.
So presumably there's no tie.
There is no tie.
Somebody could be absent.
Somebody could be absent on a very important vote, but...
And then do you get that?
I guess that you would have gotten it
but
before the Mayor.
Happened.
It never happened. Never happened. I do think that what the role of the Public Advocate was, people used to call me and say, is that all you can say is, quiet please, because you are trying to keep people quiet in the galleries and things like that.
You're just trying to preside without content, without
Yes.
inserting your own opinions into things?
Absolutely. And I tried to do it, and I had a very good relationship with most of the council people. I knew we had a lot of eye contact with each other. We knew what to do, when to do it. We knew who the speaker knew that she could allow certain people to speak longer. I would go along with it. So it's pretty process-oriented, if you see what I mean, not content.
And I guess in a council with 48 Democrats and 3 Republicans, you don't get a lot of ties to break.
No tie.
So where is the impact in your job coming from?
Well, the impact in the job is coming from, and this is again, the reality sinking in. The impact comes from the bully pulpit, to be able to get up there and to make enough noise in order to get the press's attention so the press reports on you. And I'm not denigrating in any way what the previous public advocate Mark Green did, because he was a very good foil to Rudy Giuliani, and it was very important to have it. In my case, I believe I had a very different situation. You had a very different mayor. Mayor Bloomberg is very different than Mayor Giuliani. And it wasn't as easy. And by the way, that may be my failing. I am not a press hound. I don't like to go out there and get the press's attention. And you know what? That is exactly one of the reality checks.
And you got it from both sides. You got it for being too quiet and not confrontational enough with the sitting mayor, and you got it in that New York Post editorial that we saw when you did make noise.
Exactly, and I got the Knucklehead Award from the Daily News because I criticized the mayor. Go figure.
Bill de Blasio, in his acceptance speech last night, or victory speech, is still technically just a primary, was very specific about the 4 things that he wants to focus on as public advocate: improving schools, spurring affordable housing, protecting the vulnerable, and better relations between the NYPD and New Yorkers. How similar or different is that to the list that you might make of the 4 things that you have focused on?
Well, I think the vulnerable New Yorkers and education are have been two very, very important issues for me. And I focused on them. I think that one of the very important accomplishments that I had was helping the most vulnerable New Yorkers who have no place else to turn. To me, that was the important part of the office as it evolved, as the reality set in. I took the ombudswoman's function very, very seriously. I would take calls, get one call about a man who didn't have food stamps. We started a whole program, citywide program, to get more New Yorkers food stamps. That was the kind of, bingo accomplishment I think that we had. Now we signed up about 70,000 New Yorkers for food stamps. To me, that was a very important accomplishment, Brian. And in education, my education report, which I will have to show you here, which was all paid for by private money that I raised from my not-for-profit.
Let's see, final report of the Commission on School Governance.
Yes. This was the report that the legislature used as a blueprint for its legislation on school governance, on mayoral control.
In other words, to renew mayoral control.
Yes, to renew mayoral control. There was only one recommendation that we put here that they didn't accept, but everything else was accepted. And I'm very, very proud of it.
Including more parental input,
yes,
because that was the major revision.
Yes, more parental input. There were issues of, I think the one issue that they didn't do was having the mayor have fewer appointments to the so-called Board of Education. But, by the way, more parental input is a very important and serious issue, and I plan to continue working on that even after I'm gone.
You've done this job for 8 years. Mark Green has done this job for 8 years. That's the entire history of the office, because it was only created 16 years ago. How different a public advocate were you from Mark Green? And I understand that you've already said he was there in the Giuliani era, which defined it differently to some degree. What about other differences or similarities?
Well, I think real difference was I focused much more on the ombuds function of the office. When I came into office, it was all done by hand. It wasn't technologically into the 21st century, and that was something I did. I brought it in. I technologically brought it up. I emphasized making the workers be far more, giving them more education, more tools, more capacity. And we have wonderful ombuds workers. They all, actually most of them, many of them were there when Mark Green was there. And they're terrific. They know CityServe. They know how to help you if you have lost your welfare check, or if your heating is off. They really know how to function, and they know how to do a job, and I'm very proud of them. I think that one of the differences between Mark and me is that Mark was brilliant getting press, and I wouldn't take that away from him for a minute. That's not who I am, and it's just the real difference between the two of us.
You told me a heartbreaking story off the air about a time that you tried to get press for one of your ombuds functions and draw attention to what the city calls adult protective services, taking care of vulnerable elderly who are in decline and who may not have family to take care of them. What happened?
Well, we were approached through our ombuds line, by the way, by some doctors from Mount Sinai, who was part of their function at, I guess, the Gerontology Center at Mount Sinai, is to go into the neighborhoods where there are people who have no family, who are either living in very squalid conditions, and nobody to take care of them. And they called us and they said the conditions are deplorable. The city isn't doing what it's supposed to do. We did a report. We had a press conference. We actually had someone who didn't really want to go on camera, but we really had bad stories about people who had collected, I mean, horrible things in their apartments, and nobody was taking care of them. And we had a lot of meetings with the city, and we really were trying to get something done here. And we figured if the press would take a hold of this, maybe we'd get some more help and more people would get involved, and I could have raised some private money to help these people a little, to help the Adult Protective Services Division of the city. No press outlet came to our press conference.
Zero.
Zero. Not one.
So we have a minute left. You're going to go out to dinner with Bill de Blasio one of these nights. You're going to have a glass of wine. You're going to say, Bill, here's the one thing you got to remember.
The one thing, Bill, you've got to remember, you have to get an independent budget for this office. You need a baseline budget that you never go below. I think $5 million, 10% of the city council's budget is perfect. You could have your ombuds service stretch so you can really be efficient. I think you could also have the very agencies. I never went after the police department, quite frankly, because I didn't have enough knowledge or enough people in my office to really understand what was going on at the police department. That doesn't mean that that I shouldn't have done it, but we just couldn't do it because I focused so much more on health, the human services area.
Betsy Gotbaum, outgoing New York City public advocate, thank you for your service. Good luck.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you very much.
Coming up, this week's online video picks, including a crash test, the 59 versus 2009 Chevy. This is Brian Lehrer Live.
Watch Canapé, the French cultural magazine show, Thursdays on CUNY TV.
Mama was queen of the mambo, Papa was king of the Congo. Deep down in the jungle, I start banging my first bongo. Every monkey like to be in my place instead of me, 'cause I'm the king of bongo, baby, I'm the king of bongo bong. I went to the big town where there is a lot of sound, from the jungle to the city looking for a bigger crown. So I play my boogie for the people of big city, but they don't go crazy when I'm banging on my boogie. I'm the king of the bongo, king of the bongo bong. Hear me when I come, baby. King of the bongo, king of the bongo bong. Nobody like to be in my place instead of me, 'cause nobody go crazy when I'm banging on my boogie. I'm a king without a crown, hanging loose in a big town, but I'm a king of bongo, baby, I'm the king of bongo bong.
Ma, guess what? I went back to college. No, I didn't quit my job. I'm finishing my degree with a CUNY Online Bachelor's in Business. I interact online with real City University of New York faculty on a schedule that fits my busy life. Ma, you should look who's teaching at CUNY. And it all leads to a high-quality Bachelor of Science degree in business. I can attend class anywhere, anytime. Yes, Mom, even at your house Friday night for dinner.
The CUNY Online Baccalaureate. get back to business.
This is Brian Lehrer Live, where web video meets the issues. Here are this week's 5 web video picks. Number 1, think the U.S. automakers haven't made any progress in the last 50 years? Their bank accounts may be crashing, but when their cars do, we have a far better chance of survival. Watch this video released earlier this month by the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. It features a crash between a 1959 Chevy Bel Air and a 2009 Chevy Malibu. Well, as you can see in that little silent movie, today's Chevy held up much better than yesterday's. Pretty encouraging. Of course, a bicycle is never a match for a car, even in a minor collision, so the city's been giving bikes their own lanes, including new highly protected ones to and from the Manhattan Bridge. Our video pick number 2 is from streetfilms.org.
Hey everybody, Street Films here to talk about something new and exciting here in New York City. It's a physically separated bi-directional bike path that's located right down the middle of the road. It's the Sand Street Bike Path.
If you take a look over here, we've got 2 entrance ramps to the 2 directions of the BQE on the right-hand side of the street. And on most two-way streets, that's where cyclists ride and that's where the bike lanes are, on the right-hand side. So what we did here was there's so many cars and trucks turning on those ramps, it wouldn't be safe to have the cyclists and those cars and trucks mix.
The Sand Street Bike Path has 2 different sections to it, really. One is a completely physically separated lane right down the middle. The other section, which runs right through the middle of the Farragut houses, has this mountable curb.
There's a unique design on each block. The block we're standing has the barrier wall, so it's very unique. We have the bike path in the center, and it's raised and it's protected on this block by a concrete barrier. And the other block between Gold and Navy Street is actually unique as well. It's our first bike lane with a 3-level roadway design.
Now, from a sea of bikes on the Manhattan Bridge to a mile-long sea of green across the Brooklyn Bridge. Our video pick number 3 this week is from the New York Times site, which covered last week's protests coinciding with Iranian President Ahmadinejad's attendance at the UN General Assembly. The Iranian diaspora-led protests were the largest here since the Islamic Revolution in 1979.
Hundreds of protesters staged a 3rd demonstration Thursday against President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, marching across the Brooklyn Bridge into Manhattan.
Brooklyn Bridge is one of New York's most well-known landmarks. And today what they're doing here, they're unfurling a nearly 1-mile green scroll that has been signed by hundreds of thousands of people around the world protesting the election results in Iran and protesting Ahmadinejad government's actions against the Iranian people. The focus today would be to turn Brooklyn Bridge green and to provide solidarity and let the Iranian people know that everyone is standing up with them, hearing them, watching what is happening to them, and to also make sure that Ahmadinejad's visit to New York is as uncomfortable as possible.
Video pick number 4. Every year around Labor Day, tens of thousands of people gather in the Black Rock Desert of Nevada for the alternative festival known as Burning Man. A city is created, then disappears a week later without a trace. Time.com made this video of Burning Man founder Larry Harvey on 5 things that cities can learn from the desert encampment. One thing he says New York has learned is to create car-free zones.
New York City is on the way to turning Times Square into a plaza. At first, the police were afraid people would hit each other with the cheap lawn chairs they provided. And what they did is people discovered that their own agency, they could make their world, which is what we give everyone a chance to do him. And instantly, with no direction, they made conversational circles and all kinds of things.
Next, encourage self-reliance, like having everyone deal with their own trash.
I mentioned to the mayor of New York City a couple years ago that we didn't have any garbage cans in Black Rock City. And believe me, this city generates, some waste. And I'm trying to cut down on that. But his eyebrows arched nearly into orbit. He's very struck by that extraordinary fact. We've actually made everyone, just through the dissemination of culture and values, responsibility for their share of the consumption stream.
The Burning Man Festival website reminds us what urban activist Jane Jacobs once said, that, quote, cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only when they are created by everybody. And video pick number 5 from the group Improv Everywhere, the Subway Yearbook. The improv team descended on a number 6 train and deemed it the Subway Class of 2009.
All right, twist your knees on over to this side, chin up, with the knee, there you go. Good portrait right there. Big smile from Mom and Dad, yeah! All right, one more. Oh, look at me, big pearly whites, yeah, big smile now, yeah. Chin up just a little bit, perfect. Now, how about the girlfriend? Oh, I think you played. Alright, you don't even need to hold on to the pole. You've done this before. Wonderful.
So thanks everybody. This is our last stop. We're getting off, and we appreciate you guys taking your photo with us today. Mr. Nichols, did you get some good shots?
Yeah, try that on the G train at 3 a.m. And those are this week's online video picks. This is Brian Lehrer Live, where web video meets the issues. What grade would you give the New York City public schools? My next guest has been studying that question for years. Beth Fertig is a longtime education reporter for WNYC Radio, been on my program there countless times. Now she's written a new book about the city's schools under the Bloomberg administration. It's called Why Can't You Teach Me to Read? Welcome, Beth.
Thanks, Brian.
You focus on 3 learning disabled students. Out of all the things that you could have written about regarding the New York City public schools, about which you know everything and a half, why did you choose this?
I did a radio series for WNYC in 2006 about the very low graduation rate for special education students in New York City. I was really struck by how few of these children were graduating high school, especially given that most of them have learning disabilities, and if they get the right help, they should be able to graduate. But only about less than a quarter of them were graduating in 4 years, which is half the national average. So I asked the group Advocates for Children, which had been very involved in this issue, can you find me a few kids who, tell this story for me, because I want to interview some children who had problems getting through school. They found me a couple of doozies. They found me a young woman named Emilka, who was at the time 22 years old, and she had graduated high school in 2004, I think it was. Yeah, we met in 2006. So she had graduated high school 2 years earlier with a special education diploma, knowing only 8 letters of the alphabet. And they had won her 1,500 hours of private tutoring at taxpayer expense. That's about $120,000.
To make up for this, right? Let's back up a little bit. How did she get through with a diploma knowing only a handful of letters of the English language? Were her teachers not aware of this?
It's a number of disasters that all seem to spiral. It was like every bad luck scenario that could have happened to this young woman. First of all, she was an immigrant, so her family they were from the Dominican Republic. They didn't speak the language, so they couldn't navigate the public school system. They had barely any formal education themselves, so they didn't really know what to expect in schools. They just hoped, we're coming to America, it's going to be better. Everything will be better here. She had not had a formal education in the Dominican Republic because her parents had to go ahead of her to New York, left her behind with a relative who declined to enroll her in school, sort of took the family money that was meant for her to go to school and kept her as a personal servant. So she arrives in New York at the age of 10, knowing nothing in Spanish or English. And it turns out she has a learning disability, which was never diagnosed. It took the middle school 4 years to figure out that this poor girl couldn't read in Spanish or English. They put her in English as a second language classes thinking, oh, she just doesn't know English, and nobody could figure out that she wasn't reading. So all these things were conspiring against her. And then I think because of the policy of social promotion and extremely low expectations for special education students, nobody expected her to do better. They just said, okay, you can graduate high school at age 21, the maximum, get your special ed diploma, which is just stating that you've met, you know, a couple of goals that we'll set for you, and that's that.
And a similar thing was happening to her brother.
Yeah, yeah, and he had gotten to high school unable to read. He also had a learning disability. These things often run in families. The two of them were left together behind in the DR when they were young, and so both of them are not going to school. And he was, I think at that time, he had gone to a couple of different high schools, and they stuck him in a GED type of program, like a high school equivalency program in a high school. And he went to, I think he went to a guidance counselor and said, you know, I got to get out of here, something's going wrong, and they sent him to get an evaluation, which is something that a lot of middle class and well-educated families know, that if you don't like how your child is doing, if you want your child to get evaluated for special education services, or if your child is in special ed, you have a right under federal law to a free and appropriate education. And so you can say, I want my child evaluated. You can go for, you know, more tests than they'll do in the regular school system. They can go to a clinic and get testing. So this young man was, his name is Alejandro in the book, he was sent to a clinic where they gave him more evaluations, and then they told him that he was entitled to a lawyer, which is the other thing that a lot of middle-class families know. So he went to Advocates for Children, and he won approximately, it came in 2 chunks. He won almost 2,000 hours of tutoring at taxpayer expense. And when he won his award, he said, can you do anything about my sister Yamilka? She's sitting at home. She graduated high school last year. And then they won, and just before her 22nd birthday, when she would have expired, she wouldn't expire, the right to get the services expired. She won 1,500 hours, which they believe is the biggest single chunk ever awarded to a special education child for
So is this
neglect.
part of it's an amazing story too, incredible stories, heartbreaking, and also a lesson in empowerment and using the system to at least get some retribution or redress of your grievance if you get that far without being taught how to read. Are they reflective of something systemic beyond their own stories?
I would say that these 3 students, Yamilka, her brother Alejandro, and the other boy that I profile, Antonio, they're extreme examples. You know, students getting to high school unable to read, that's pretty extreme. But I use them to illustrate the bigger problem, which is that throughout this country, not just in New York, too many students are getting through high school not reading at the level that we would require in a 21st century economy. They're, you know, wherever you go, the national tests are showing that our students are not performing as well as students in other developed countries. And on the national test, which is called the Nation's Report Card, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, something like 25% of 8th graders weren't even reading at a basic level, which means they couldn't get basic information or understand the main idea of a short paragraph. So that means that even though, you know, we say American literacy rates are 99%, you know, just like all other developed nations, there are many levels within literacy of, you could be fully literate, college ready, or you could be just sort of functionally literate and doing well enough just to pass a driver's license. So I think there are many people in this country not doing well enough, and in New York City specifically, there are thousands of students who get through high school, just sort of bump along, meeting the state standard, which is very, very low, or graduating just below that state standard. And
it's a very interesting idea, one that a lot of viewers probably have never thought of, that there are different standards, different definitions of literacy, and that the definition may even have changed over time. I want to hold up the cover to your book, one, so people know what it looks like, but also, is this on purpose? why can't you teach me to read? If the shot is tight enough, people will be able to see that Cant has no apostrophe. You use the letter U for the word you, the number 2 for the word to, like somebody might in a text message or an IM. Are you trying to say something about literacy in the internet era, or is that a coincidence?
My publisher for R. Strauss Giroux came up with the concept. We thought it was very catchy. It was a way to draw attention to the book and to also highlight that, yeah, there are a lot of people who think that because of all the texting and the use of the internet, maybe people's literacy skills are not, formal literacy skills may be dropping, or children, teachers often complain that kids are texting, or writing the way that they would text using, the U and the, spelling things out as little acronyms or whatever. And there have been studies on whether this is affecting learning. The Pew Institute, I believe, did a study. And children generally know what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. I think that what I hear complaints about a lot in New York City is that their grammar skills are very poor, which could have something to do with the elementary level, and it could also be, the texting culture.
The mayor, the chancellor, have tried to take this issue very seriously of literacy in the modern era. They're instituting and have instituted a computerized tracking system. Some of you may know of CompStat in the police department that was credited for turning around crime statistics neighborhood by neighborhood, even block by block, and they're trying to do something similar with education?
Yes, it's called ARIS, Achievement Reporting Innovation System. It's an $80 million computer system, a web-based computer system that's putting together all the different systems that the Department of Education had for tracking students. So there's attendance, there's demographic, information from the household, who gets free lunch, who's special ed, what the test scores are. They're putting it all in one place, and they've spent the past few years rolling this out. It was designed by IBM. There were some problems along the way in terms of how you get so many buckets of information together into one system when you have 1 million students, something like 150,000 employees in the system. Not everybody has access to everybody else's records, because certain teachers can see their own classroom's performance and who's got free lunch and who's not in their own classroom, but you wouldn't want them to see, for privacy reasons, what is going on in the other classes. So it's a very, very complicated system, and there were a few bumps along the way, but it's out there now, and it is working. And what's interesting about it is I hear so many mixed opinions from teachers and principals about the value of it, because there are some people who say, look, ARIS is great because it gives me all that information in one place, and I can look at my classroom list and I'll know which kids are not doing well on their assessments, because coupled with ARIS means you have to give more assessments in order to track how the kids are doing before that big annual test, because you don't want to just wait for the end of the school year or wait for the test and then find out that your kid's bombed. You want to give them practice tests throughout. So some teachers like that. Others say, look, if I'm a good teacher, I know how well my students are reading based on what books they're reading, based on having dialogue with them about, did you understand what this meant, based on the quality of their writing. I'd rather have smaller classes. So there's a controversy over it, and I think there's a lot of different opinions right now, but this is definitely the wave of the present, because President Obama wants to use the stimulus money to reward districts and states that use this sort of data-driven instruction, looking at how your children are doing and then tailoring your instruction to the ones who are struggling or grouping them in different ways. And New York wants to certainly get some of that federal money.
And the whole point, I think, of the federal No Child Left Behind law was to really focus on the bottom, to not let schools kind of aggregate their test scores and say, oh, on average, we're doing really well, because that allows you to miss students like the 3U profile with learning disabilities who could be kind of statistically averaged in with everybody else. So there are all kinds of littler ways that schools have to break out success. Is it helping the city to identify who these individuals are? Because maybe funding is only going to flow to the city from Washington if they do help students like the ones you profile.
Well, the city's come up with this interesting system of progress reports, which you've probably heard a lot about, which is when they give the letter grade to the schools, the report card. And at first, when it happened 2 years ago, these progress reports are generated by ARIS, the computer system, so that they could track the progress that schools are making and know specifically how well are they doing with black students, Hispanic students, low-income students, special education students, English language learners, and then see, are those students making at least a year's worth of progress? And so they ideally gave schools grades based on how well they were doing and giving them extra points if they did a good job with these students at risk. So you had a situation where schools that had very good reputations were given low marks at first because they weren't getting all their kids even higher, even though maybe 80 or 90% of their kids were reading and meeting state standards, and the same with math. If their kids weren't making at least a year's worth of progress, they were penalized and got C's or D's. So you had a few of those cases. Then you had cases of schools where only 30 or 40% of the kids were at state levels and they were getting A's because they did make progress. Now it's evolved to the situation where this year 97% of schools got A's and B's because they'd made so much progress that it sort of was criticized for devaluing the whole concept of progress. So that's one of the criticisms against Bloomberg, is that he's sort of manipulating the numbers when in fact they define progress in many different ways, and you can say the schools are doing better based on this formula, or the schools still aren't doing good enough. The city says it's going to revise the system for next year, and the state has also said that its standards need to be higher because scores are going up in New York City, and that's partly why so many schools got A's and B's, because the scores went up everywhere in New York City. They went up all around the state, and the state recognizes that they need to make the standards a little higher.
So you've been an education reporter for 10 years. Has doing this book changed your perspective on education in New York?
Oh, God, yeah. You know, when you're a reporter, especially in public radio, where we have a small newsroom, you can't spend all of your time on one subject. And writing this book, as much as I've spent time over the years going to classrooms and doing stories about education, a lot of what happens in education in New York City, as you know, Brian, is political. It's all driven by politics in New York. So to spend a year where I could go into classrooms, see how children learn to read, spend a lot of time with these 3 students and see, you know, what were Yamilka's challenges in trying to learn how to read, and how did disabilities get in the way and make it harder for her? What was happening with her brother? And to see, okay, the techniques that they're applying with these 3 students who have severe learning disabilities to help them learn to read, is that taking place in the public schools? Where is it taking place? What are schools learning now that there's more interventions than there used to be? And they use phonics more than they used to use when these kids were small and they weren't exposed to the types of techniques that could have helped children with, you know, serious learning disabilities. I'm not saying everyone should get phonics, but teachers should definitely have the tools at their disposal to help children who need more help with reading. So it was very interesting for me to go to all the different schools, see what sort of programs are out there, and to say, you know, wow, I'm starting to get my own little graduate school here in the New York City public education world. And there are 1,500 schools in the city. Whenever people ask me, are the schools getting better, I say, there are no 2 schools that are the same. And Mayor Bloomberg's reforms have made some schools do a great job, and there's others who feel like they didn't need the, you know, the directives from City Hall that they got, or maybe they needed just the smaller classes or the more experienced teachers. It's a different story in every school in the city, and there's going to be a lot of debate throughout this election cycle.
And it'll be an education for anybody who reads this book. Beth, thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
This is Brian Lehrer Live, where web video meets the issues. Coming up, a hack view of the city. That's not a judgment, it's taxi stories.
Did you know CUNY leads the way for students with disabilities?
CUNY leads to my career as a healthcare professional.
CUNY leads to my career as an accountant.
CUNY leads to my career as a music teacher.
CUNY leads means linking employment, academics, and disability services. If you're a CUNY student with a visible or invisible disability, the City University of New York offers eligible students free career development and placement services.
Gain access to exciting employment opportunities through the power of a CUNY education.
As an employer, CUNY Leads provides me with a more qualified, diverse workforce. Each campus has its own leads counselor, a go-to person who knows you
and helps you enjoy every aspect of college life.
For more information and to find out if you qualify, visit cuny.edu/CUNYLeads. CUNY leads to the career I always wanted.
Real men know that getting tested is the way to take care of their families. That's why real men wear gowns. For a list of the tests you need, go to ahrq.gov.
There we go. It's Brian Lehrer Live, where web video meets the issues. Taxi drivers. We love them. We hate them. They are very New York.
It really is everybody from all over the world, not just getting into the cab, but driving the cab.
I'm from Haiti.
I come from Bangladesh.
I'm from Ghana, West Africa.
I'm from Pakistan.
Russia. I'm from Rockland County, New York.
And I'm from Kingston, Jamaica.
New Yorkers don't understand what the life of a New York cab driver is like.
You don't really pay too much attention unless you're in one or getting cut off by one.
You love them and you hate them, you love to hate them.
They're almost people like us because they know we are a hard worker, we're honest.
There are New Yorkers who love taxi drivers, but more New Yorkers hate taxi drivers.
No one gives the respect to cab drivers.
They think that we are gypsies, man.
People think that you come from a foreign country and you just jump in the cab and you're an illegal alien.
They can't believe there's a white cab driver still driving in New York.
Oh, we are human beings too. We're not from, Mars or someplace like that.
And what if you wrote an oral history of New York City since the 1970s, set entirely in taxicabs? Well, that's more or less what my next guest has done. Author Amy Braunschweiger uncovered the best taxi stories she could find and compiled them in a new book called Taxi Confidential: Life, Death, and 3 a.m. Revelations in New York City. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
This book is so much fun. What were you setting out to do?
You know, it's amazing to me that the book hasn't been done yet. Taxi drivers are everywhere. They're ubiquitous. If New York is the most urban city, taxi drivers are the most urban job. And it's also the perfect setting for a story. You have two strangers stuck in a cab, you're careening along the highway, and if something happens, you're both stuck, and you both have to deal with it. And who knows what's going to come out of that situation. So I just made it my job to go and find all these times when an unknown variable forced the passengers and drivers to interact and see what happened.
And your stories are told both from the passengers' points of view and the drivers' points of view.
Exactly.
Which is totally cool because it is about that intersection. It's funny, in that web video, which is not related to you or your book, there was that reference to that guy as the last white cab driver in New York City.
He's actually in my book.
Who is that?
His name is John McDonough, and he's my cabbie activist. I wrote a profile of him for the book. And basically, he was, I think, born in the Bronx or Brooklyn, Irish-American parents, really embraces his Irish-American heritage, and he's a huge political activist. He was in the Army. During the Vietnam War, he was serving in Germany. Afterwards, he hitchhiked around the world, saw a lot of things, and he basically came back with a very set political view. And he came back. He wanted a good job. He got a job as a cab driver, but then he used his cab to further his politics, which is what I found so interesting about him. And while he's very left, and while Bush was in office, he formed a group called Cabbies Against Bush, or CAB. And basically, when the Republican National Convention came to New York, he put on this campaign, whereas he offered everyone at the convention a free ticket to Baghdad if they would go fight in the war for the Americans. And he got on Fox News doing this. It's a great story.
There's another driver who you profile, Seth Golden, who has a passenger say to him at one point, You're the only white cab driver in New York. Do you know the story I'm talking about?
I do. It's called The King of the Jews, and we can call him by his real name here. It's Seth Goldman. He doesn't really mind. And yeah, that's also one of my favorite stories. It's a touching, heartwarming story about basically Seth grew up and he was Jewish, and he starts the story by saying that his father didn't really try very hard to instill Jewish culture in him. He didn't say, you have to learn Mahler, or he didn't say, study the Torah. But at one point in his life, he said, Seth, come here, sit down. And then he said to Seth, Seth, I'm going to teach you your culture. I'm going to show you who you are. And then he put on the record The 2,000-Year-Old Man, starring Mel Brooks. And from that point on, Seth became Mel Brooks's favorite fan. And so, fast forward to the future, Seth is a cab driver. He stops, somebody's hailing his cab. Turns out it's Mel Brooks. And the story is all about his conversation with Mel Brooks and how he's trying to rope Mel Brooks in slowly without revealing his identity.
So in other words, he's a big Mel Brooks fan, never met him, not on Mel Brooks's radar screen in any way.
Exactly.
And then Mel Brooks, of all people, steps into his taxi cabs.
And so I really try to get into Seth's head and hear what he was thinking, what was his strategy, what was he freaking out about. And it was just this give and take, this long conversation between the two of them, talking about everything from sandwiches and tuna to wives and relationships. It was a fantastic conversation. And at one point, Mel did say something about, wow, you're a white cab driver. And Seth always has a patent remark for these scenarios. He always pauses, and then he'll say something like, oh no, I'm not white, I'm Jewish. Or if somebody says, oh, you're an American cab driver, he'll say, oh no, I'm not American, I was born in Brooklyn.
That'll either start or stop a conversation, right?
Yes.
Either of those things. Do you see, since you started in the 1970s with your stories and come up to the present, do you see the history of crime in New York?
Yes, very much so. A lot of the stories from the 70s and the 80s were just, they were either more violent or the cab drivers were more worried about violence being acted upon them. And you can even see, in all these cab stories, I try to set a scene. And the scene that's set is the city that you're driving around in. And in the 70s and the 80s, they're talking about abandoned areas, warehouse areas, crack neighborhoods. It's very different than the scene that's set today.
You have one story about someone visiting a crack house.
Yes. Yeah, that is, for me, one of the most heartbreaking stories in the book. It's told by a cab driver named Peter Kane, and part of what's so heartbreaking is Peter Kane's own history. At the time, he was an alcoholic. And basically, he was called to take a trip to a crack house. He didn't know at the time it was to a crack house, but he was told that he had to go pick somebody up on the street, and he picked up a father and his son. And then he drove them only 10 blocks away to the crack house, and the father went in and left the son, who was about 3 or 4, I think, alone in the car with the cab driver for more than half an hour.
Yeah, I just read the story. He's 5 years old.
Yeah, 5 years old, and it's just about this cab driver thinking, identifying with the kid. You know, his own father was an alcoholic. He wished the kid would have a better life, and then noticing how scared the kid was and trying to make him feel comfortable. Well, he himself was terrified. What if the father doesn't come back out of the house? What then? What if the family accuses him of something? He's been alone in the cab with this kid. And it's just all of these moving pieces going on in this story.
I guess this indicates a larger narrative. I wonder if you get to this consciously, that there's contact across class lines between cab passengers and cab drivers on a routine basis in a way that many people rarely encounter otherwise.
Yeah, that's true, and that's something that I didn't really realize specifically until I started getting into the book. And there's a lot of stories that I heard that weren't published in the book, but you definitely notice, well, when you look at the fact that cabs are in Manhattan, and in Manhattan I think something like the average income per week, this was before the financial meltdown, I don't know anymore, but it was over $2,000. That's a healthy income, and most cabbies live in Queens, where the average income per week is closer to $500. And so you have two very different lifestyles going on here. You also have it's not just economic, but it's also socio. About 90% of cab drivers are born outside of the United States. And while a large percentage of Manhattanites are born outside of the U.S. too, more American born. There's different expectations going into the situation from both sides of the partition.
And so your story, Too Close to Home, gets to this demographic change among the drivers a little bit. Can you tell us a very short version?
Yes. Too Close to Home takes place after 9/11, and the main characters are, there's a woman in the back of the car, I think her name was Lisa, and then a cabbie in the front of the car. And basically, she was having a great conversation with him. He was from Pakistan, and he was older. He was talking about his granddaughter. And then she asked him where he was from, and after this wonderful conversation about his family, he flipped out when she asked where he was from, pulled the car over, and basically they ended up on the street yelling at each other. She just wanted to know where he was from, and he was reading something very different into that in a post-9/11 environment.
I wonder if the advent of television monitors in the back of every cab now will lead to fewer stories for you or someone like you to write a sequel to this book in 10 or 20 more years. Are people stopping talking to each other now, the drivers and the passengers, because there's the video screen?
I think people are talking to each other a little bit less. I don't think the video screen is the problem. Most people hate the video screen and turn it off immediately, but it's the iPhone, it's the iPod, it's any kind of listening device or cell phone that you have in your ear. There's a lot of people who wouldn't talk to their cab drivers anyway, and a lot of cab drivers who wouldn't talk to me when I tried talking to them, so you just give them your space. But definitely when people are on the phone now, you're not interacting the way that you used to.
My son says, Daddy, you always try to interview the cab drivers. And sometimes they want to be, and sometimes they just want to be quiet.
Yes, exactly. So if somebody wants to be quiet, I just step back and I can be quiet. But I'm Midwestern. Even before I started doing this book, I was talking to cab drivers all the time. So,
thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
It's Brian Lehrer Live. A final video before we go. It's from Engadget.com. Don't have anyone to help pedal your tandem bicycle? How about Jules the robot? The only time the guy in the back did his share. And that's it for this week's show. We are here live Wednesday nights at 7:30 or anytime online at brianlehrer.tv. And tune into my daily radio show, 10 a.m. on WNYC Radio tomorrow morning, Democratic mayoral candidate Bill Thompson on affordable housing. That's 10 a.m. on WNYC 93.9 FM and AM 820. Have a great night.